In my opinion, Immanuel Kant is one of the greatest and most important of philosophers. His Critique of Pure Reason is quite difficult to read, but it's one of the most profound and important books that I have ever read. In this series of videos, I'll give you some of the basics so you can better understand his Critique of Pure Reason. Let's start with the famous spectacle or glasses metaphor. Imagine every human being, including yourself, is born with green spectacles on and that there is no way to take these spectacles off. They are part of your brain, your apparatus by which you not only view the world, but constitute it. So you perceive everything as green and you are not capable of perceiving anything as not green because your brain colors all as green. Notice too that you think the greenness must be out there in the world because you learn all things must be green from your experience of the world. However, if you believe this, you would be mistaken. You would be mistaken if you believe greenness comes from empirical experience because the greenness comes from the spectacles, the lenses, not the world. Now let's move away from the metaphor and get into Kant. In a similar way, Kant argued that your experience of space, time, causation, mathematics, and a few other ways of thinking and intuiting come from the spectacles, not the physical world. Your knowledge of space and time may arise with experience, but it's not ultimately from experience. So you might be thinking, well, this is really interesting theory, but how does Kant prove that space and time and so on are in the spectacles? And this is where it really gets interesting. Much of his book, The Critique, is just that. It's a proof using epistemology to prove that space and time and so on must be in the spectacles, not from the world. Kant will use different types of knowledge claims that we make to show that some of these knowledge claims have properties that cannot come from experience or mere thinking. They must come from the spectacles. So in later videos in this series, I'll explain that in more detail, but for now, just keep in mind the spectacle metaphor. Before concluding, let me clarify a couple other points. Notice that space and time, this spectacle metaphor, it's not committed to the idea that space and time are not real. This is because, according to the metaphor, we cannot know reality in itself. Reality in itself is what Kant calls the noumenal world. We can only know reality as we constitute it through the spectacles, what Kant calls the phenomenal world. That is, we cannot take off our spectacles to see if space and time are really out there. Okay, we can never transcend our spectacles. So science, math, religion, and other claims of knowledge are destroyed by Kant and his system. These things work, but they aren't real or ultimate knowledge. Kant has divided reality in two, the unknowable noumenal world and the knowable world, that is, the phenomenal world, that we perceive through our spectacles. So the world of science, logic, math, and experience, that's the phenomenal world. Now, Kant calls this spectacle view his Copernican revolution. He says that, quote, hitherto it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects, but Kant believes we will make better progress when we suppose and then prove that objects conform to the mind. Just as Copernicus tried to show the sun does not go around the earth, but vice versa, so Kant will show that your knowledge doesn't have to conform to reality. Rather, objects conform to the mind as well. That is, the mind is not a blank slate. It's active, not passive, and we can discover how it is active not by looking out at the world, like mathematicians, scientists, and many philosophers do, but only by examining the lenses, the spectacles themselves. And as we shall see later, this will be accomplished through epistemology. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, hasn't science answered these questions? So, for example, hasn't Einstein corrected Kant's view of space and time? And the short answer is no. The Newtonian view of space is not necessary for the Kantian view. This is a common misunderstanding even among some scholars. Also, Einstein and other scientists, they do not address this because what Kant is exploring is what is presupposed for any experience of space at all, whereas Einstein and modern physicists are exploring the empirical properties of space. Einstein is doing science. Kant is exploring what is presupposed for any science at all. The first step of science is observation, and this presupposes certain categories by which to observe. Kant is seeking ultimate truth. Science is seeking empirical truths and what works. I should also add that Kant will never be as famous as these scientists because most of us are struggling to survive and we want what works. We want toasters and nuclear weapons, not ultimate truths or arguments about the unknowability of ultimate truth. However, there are moments when we do want that kind of deeper knowledge, and this is when Kant becomes interesting. Whatever the case, Kant is difficult to understand, but the effort is well worth it. Please see the next 3 videos in this series. Thank you. So Kant is profound, but he's also difficult to understand because he uses and creates an intimidating vocabulary. So in this video I'll review some of the basic vocab and concepts that you need to start understanding the Critique of Pure Reason. First, notice his book is called Pure Reason. It's pure because he's considering reason stripped of all its empirical content. He's not doing science or logic or math, he's considering what is presupposed in order to do them at all. To use a metaphor from video 1, he's looking at the spectacles by which we constitute our world. Another phrase you should know is transcendental idealism. When you hear this, just think of the spectacle metaphor again. Transcendental idealism refers to the attempt to understand what must be in place, a priori and necessarily, in order to have any experience at all. It's an attempt to show what must be in the spectacles from which we constitute experience. So transcendental arguments are those that infer the conditions necessary for experience. And it's interesting that cognitive psychologists are now using this type of argument as well. So Kant was well before his time. A third word is intuition, and Kant uses this word differently than we do. It means for him to behold. The intuitions are the necessary conditions for sensory experience, that which must be in the spectacles to experience anything at all, so to speak. So in the third video, I'll show you how Kant proves that space and time must be a priori intuitions. They're in the spectacles, not derived from experience or thinking. Okay, so let's look at the historical context by looking at Kant's predecessor, David Hume. Hume argued that knowledge is of two types. It's either synthetic or analytic. An example of a synthetic claim is on the left. The dog is on the table. Synthetic statements are a posteriori because we learn them from experiencing the world. We learn the dog is on the table from empirical experience. Such statements are not universal, nor are they necessary, and negating them, saying it's not the case that the dog is on the table, does not lead to a self-contradiction. However, analytic statements on the right side of the screen are contradictory when negated. For example, it's a contradiction to say it's not the case that all bachelors are single, or it's not the case that 2 + 2 = 4. Analytic statements are a priori because we know them without referring to empirical experience. So for example, I don't have to interview every bachelor to know all bachelors are single. I know it by mere thinking, a priori and semantically. And Hume thought the same sort of thing held true for math. Analytic statements are also universal and necessary. They're universal because it's true everywhere that all bachelors are single and that 2 + 2 = 4. And they're necessary because it must be the case that all bachelors are single and that 2 + 2 = 4. Finally, Hume says analytic statements are merely relations of ideas because the predicate is contained in the subject. For example, 4 is contained in 2 and 2, and single is contained in the concept of bachelor. Now here's a really important point about Hume. He believed all analytic ideas are trivial forms of knowledge because they don't tell us about the world. Synthetic knowledge, on the other hand, is not trivial. It actually tells us something about the world, like the dog is on the table. It's based on our empirical sense impressions. So math and logic are analytic. They're trivially true. They're tautological. And Hume further argued that if a book contains neither analytic nor synthetic propositions, then we should throw the book to the flames, for it contains only nonsense. All right. Now, when you think about all this, Hume is considered an empiricist because he believed all non-trivial knowledge comes from empirical experience. Rationalists, on the other hand, believe some non-trivial forms of knowledge come from mere thinking alone. And Kant will synthesize these two positions and give us a third option. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant shows that Hume's fork is a false dichotomy. This is because there is a third type of knowledge that's universal, necessary, a priori, but it's not merely a relation of ideas. The predicate is not contained in the subject. It's not merely a definition game. It actually tells us about the world, or is at least what is presupposed for experience of the world. Kant calls this knowledge synthetic a priori. It's the knowledge that comes from the spectacle, so to speak. It's the middle column in this picture. And as we progress through the critique, we'll better understand why some forms of knowledge are synthetic a priori. But keep in mind, it's a controversial issue. Here are some possible candidates for synthetic a priori knowledge. 7 + 5 = 12, 2 + 2 = 4. Right? Events have causes. Right? Now, we know synthetic a priori knowledge cannot come from experience because it's universal and necessary, and you cannot get universal and necessary knowledge from experience because you can't observe the whole universe, including the future and the past. Nor is it analytic. It's not merely relations of ideas because the subjects are not contained in the predicates, or predicates not contained in the subjects. Cause is not contained in the idea of event, like single is contained in the idea of bachelor. Always increasing is not contained in the idea of a line. We have to add a third concept, like our intuition of space, or third intuition, to see this geometrical truth. And we'll explore these more later, but for now just keep in mind that the whole critique can be seen as an attempt to answer one question. And that one question is, how is synthetic a priori knowledge possible? And as we'll see, it's only possible if you accept transcendental idealism, if you understand and accept the spectacle view of reality. So in the next video, we'll get into the meat of his arguments by exploring the strange nature of space and time. Thanks. So I find the first section of the Critique of Pure Reason really fascinating because it has a lot to say about space and time. And this section is called the Transcendental Aesthetic. So Kant starts out and he says the Transcendental Aesthetic deals with objects as they are given to us in experience, which he calls intuitions, rather than objects as they are thought, which he calls concepts. And this is important to start here because the conditions under which things are given precede those which are thought. Now Kant's central argument in this section is that space and time are a priori intuitions. So space and time are the forms of experience, not something we get from experience. Every experience must be ordered by the mind experiencing it. It must have form, and space and time are these forms. They must be in the spectacles, so to speak. So let's explore his arguments. His first two establish the a priori nature of space, and the second two establish the intuitive nature of space. And then we'll look at a couple of others too. The first argues that space is presupposed in all experience of objects separate from us. The argument is a reduction to absurdity and may be structured like this. Premise 1, representations of space are a priori or based on experience. Premise 2, if based on experience, it would be formed by objects separate from us, or separate from me. And this is absurd because such separation implies the representation of space. Therefore, the conclusion is representations of space are a priori. And by the way, this argument counters some of Locke's ideas. His second argument is based on the idea that we can think of empty space, but we cannot think of an absence of space. We can think of an absence of objects, that is to say, but not an absence of space. So space is a condition for the possibility of experience. We cannot have any experiences of the outer world, the objective world, until our minds see in space, so to speak. We cannot represent an outer world empty of space. Notice this isn't just a psychological thing because we cannot even imagine how it could be otherwise. It's transcendental. We can't even imagine how to have objects without space. So, by the way, this counters some of Leibniz's relational views of space. Okay, the next two arguments establish the intuitive nature of space. First, Kant argues that space is not a discursive thing or a concept of things in general, but a pure intuition. His point is simply that we can represent only one space and that all other spaces are in that one space. This is different from concepts like car. We can represent cars, but not all cars have to be in that one big car. The cars are not formed by limiting the concept of car. This is why space is an intuition, not a concept. The many concepts of space are formed by limiting the one intuitive space that is given in all sensibility. But nothing like this happens in concepts like cars. It's absurd to ask how do we limit car. So space is not like car. Space is an intuition, not a concept. Kant's fourth argument here, and this is for the intuitive nature of space, relies on the observation that space is infinitely big and infinitely divisible. And this is really strange and fascinating because the infinity is within space itself, not in its instances. So for example, my concept of car may have an infinite number of instances or representations under itself, like Ford, Chevy, and so on, but car is not itself infinite. Car does not have an infinite number of representations within itself, to quote Kant, only an infinite number of representations under itself. So all parts of space coexist ad infinitum. Thus space cannot be merely a concept that is thought because it does not really follow the rules of thought, so to speak. It must be an intuition. It must be something that presupposes all thought. Space the whole precedes space the parts. The part relations of space are carved out of one intuition of space. There's a part-whole relation, not a genus-species relation. So based on this, space is not empirical or conceptual, it's intuitive, it's presupposed for experience. Now, interestingly, Kant has a fifth and sixth argument elsewhere for the a priori intuitive nature of space and time. Let me briefly go over his fifth. This can be found in the A version where he argues from geometry. He says geometrical judgments cannot be based on concepts alone since they are analytic. They are not analytic, and they cannot be a posteriori since they are necessary. So unless they are based on a priori intuition, we cannot account for the synthetic a priori nature of geometry. Okay, that's his fifth argument. But here's a very interesting one. The sixth argument says arises when he asks, how can we know the difference between left and right-handed gloves if that is all that exists? And the answer is that we must simply point at them. The difference is not made intelligible by any concept. The difference is only made intelligible by an intuition of space. So again, space is an intuition. So Kant's arguments for the a priori intuitive nature of time are very similar to those for space. They replicate them. So time is presupposed to represent objects as successive or coexistent. Time can be represented as a void of appearances. Different times are part of one and the same time, and time is infinite or unlimited. So time must be an intuition, a form presupposed for experience at all. You can still have concepts of space and time, but the point is that you also have foundational or fundamental intuitions of space and time that you cannot escape. And time is this intuition of inner sense. Space is the intuition of outer sense. So how can I oversimplify all this? I think I can approach it by just asking one question. How can we get our intuitions of space from experience of the external world if those intuitions are necessary to experience the external world at all? This doesn't capture it all, but it'll get you thinking in the right direction. I think the answer is we can't, if you think deeply about it. We must get our foundational intuitions of space from the active mind itself. The mind is not a blank slate. Space and time are built into our spectacles, so to speak, and since there's no way to take the spectacles off, there's no way to know whether space and time are ultimately real. Now, as a reminder, keep in mind that Kant is not doing science or evolutionary theory or logic or math. He's going deeper. He's discovering what is presupposed for science, logic, evolutionary thinking, and math. He is engaged in the transcendental project of telling us what must be in our spectacles. Thanks. Okay, so this is the last video in the Introduction to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason series, or the fourth video at least. Maybe I'll make some more, but these 4 videos should give you the tools and the basic concepts that you need to explore his critique in more depth. And from this point on, I'll call his Critique of Pure Reason CPR, so I don't have to keep saying it. Okay. Now let's review for 5 minutes and then get to the new stuff, right? In the introduction, Kant presents a broad view of his project, which I described in video 1 and 2. He argues there's a special type of knowledge called synthetic a priori, and that this knowledge must be in our spectacles, that is transcendental, because this knowledge is universal, necessary, and tells us about the world. So Immanuel Kant encourages us to look at the instrument of knowing itself instead of assuming the instrument is a simple reflection of the way the world actually is. After all, if there is a perceiving subject, there must be some forms or spectacles from which the subject perceives and constitutes the world. So in this introduction, he introduces his Copernican revolution, a new way of understanding that's based neither on rationalism nor empiricism. Rather, it's transcendental, in that it's concerned not so much with objects as with the mode of our knowledge of objects. That is, he looks at the lenses, the spectacles, at the conditions necessary for any experience or thought at all. So to review these concepts, watch the first 2 videos again. Alright, now let's review the third video. Now that video was about the transcendental aesthetic, which is about space and time. This section is concerned with sensibility, with how objects are given to us in their immediacy. So as I look at this tree in front of me, I immediately sense greenness and hardness and movement and so on. But in order to have these raw sensory experiences, space and time must be in our irremovable spectacles, so to speak. Okay, so Kant calls this section transcendental because he's exploring what's in the spectacles, what's presupposed for any sense experience at all. And he calls it aesthetic because the Greek word aesthesis means sense perception. So the main idea of this section is that space and time are forms of sensibility, elements of our subjective cognitive constitution. And so everything in space and time are mere appearances, not things in themselves, at least as far as we know. They are in our spectacles, so to speak, right? So again, look at video 3 for a review of some of the main arguments in that section called the transcendental aesthetic. And keep in mind that that's his first proofs for his transcendental project. And it's interesting too that this section influences and is a lot about his philosophy of math, because space and time are presupposed for such math.
Space and time are the necessary conditions for experience, and they give rise to the universal and necessary nature of math. There's no other way to explain the a priori and synthetic nature of our intuitions about math and space and time. We must adopt the spectacle view, transcendental idealism. Now, one controversy that arises from the transcendental aesthetic, as an aside here, is called the Trendelenburg problem. Trendelenburg problem. And the problem arises because Kant says space does not represent any property of things in themselves. And he says that in A26b42. But how can Kant say that? How can he say that space and time are only in our spectacles? How can he know that noumenal reality, ultimate reality, is spaceless and timeless? So Kant's claim that things in themselves are non-spatial is startling because he also argues that things in themselves are unknowable. Right? How can he assert reality is non-spatial if it's unknowable? It seems that if things in themselves are truly unknowable, then we must admit the possibility that space could apply to both appearances and things in themselves. So this possibility that Kant denies was first expressed by Trendelenburg and is known as the neglected alternative. And I did a lot of research on this one. I might make a video on it one day, but it's a very interesting scholarly debate involving the best scholars and rigorous ideas about space and time. Really interesting. But let's get to the new material now, and this is the transcendental analytic, the next section. Okay, so the transcendental analytic is the next section that we're going to look at after the transcendental aesthetic. Okay, and one reason this section is more complicated is because it involves 12 spectacles or lenses instead of the 2 explored in the transcendental aesthetic, and those were space and time, right? Notice he calls this section transcendental because he's still talking about the nature of our spectacles, about what's presupposed. But he adds the word analytic because he's now focusing on what's presupposed for thinking instead of immediate sensory intuition. So for example, sensing experiences in space and time is quite different from thinking about objects or thinking about space and time. Intuitions about space and time are not the same as our concepts about space and time. The aesthetic outlines what is necessary to experience the raw, disconnected flow of sensations, but the analytic explores what's presupposed when scientists and philosophers and psychologists and others think and conceptualize and measure and theorize about space and time. Now, here are the 12 a priori organizing presupposed categories, or the 12 spectacles which the mind brings to reality. In the first group, we have quantity categories like unity, plurality, and totality. In the second category, we have quality categories, and these are reality, negation, and limitation. The third are the relation categories. These are inherence and subsistence, causality and dependence, and reciprocity. Okay, and then finally you have the modal categories. These are, possibility and of course impossibility. Then you have existence and non-existence, and you have necessity and contingency. Okay, so these 12 categories are in our lenses, so to speak. They are presupposed for thinking, not sensing, kind of. So for example, we do not derive the ideas of unity and plurality from the world, the first 2 lenses. Rather, our minds bring them to the world. Nor, as Hume demonstrated, do we get our idea of causality as this necessary connection between cause and event. We don't get this idea from experience of the world, since experience of the world merely gives us a constant conjunction of events. Rather, this idea of cause comes from the mind, the spectacles, and it makes all thinking or judgments about the empirical world possible. So if you're a bit confused right now, just keep in mind that Kant is arguing that these 12 categories are a priori. They're in the spectacles, and they give rise to thought or conceptual judgments. Now, at one point, Kant states that thoughts without content are empty, but intuitions without concepts are blind. Now, thoughts without content are empty because you cannot think unless you have data from your senses. So, now, if your eyes are closed, the data comes from past sensory experiences, of course. Okay. Now, for example, you cannot think of trees unless you had some sensory data at some point in your life. Also, imagine your mind is like a unifying force. If there's no sense data to unify, then there's no unifying thought. Nothing is thought. Now, on the other hand, intuitions without concepts are blind, because without the organizing spectacles of the thought, I would just experience a bunch of sensations like green, rough, hot, shaky, solid, brown. Okay? As noted in earlier videos, some knowledge claims arise with experience, but not ultimately from experience. So intuitions without conceptual spectacles are blind because there's no unity, no thingness, no tree. There's just all these qualities. There's just a series of raw experiences, as Hume described. So one of Kant's points is that the categories of understanding synthesize the data of sense intuition, the manifold data of sense intuition. The categories unify rough and green and brown and warm into a thing called a tree. The categories are a unifying or synthesizing force. We cannot think of trees or any other things without these 12 a priori categories that Kant outlines in the Transcendental Analytic. They are the structures of the mind, the spectacles that make conceptual thought possible. Okay. Now here's an interesting argument to consider. That's distant from what we just spoke about, but very interesting. It's from Kant's three analogies. The three analogies correspond to the three modes of time, which are permanence, succession, and coexistence. Now, they aren't quite spectacles lenses, but they show us how the spectacles are kind of applied or schematized. Anyway, the second analogy tells us why all changes must seem causal to us. It sheds some light on why we think every effect must have a cause. Even if we might think something is uncaused, we don't really. We keep looking for a cause of it. One only needs to explore the discussions on Big Bang or quantum physics to see that. Now, if you know Hume, you know he questioned the idea that every event must have a cause because we can't see any necessary connection between cause and effect in experience. We just see one thing happening after another. But Kant will show the necessary connection comes from the spectacles, so to speak. And here's the general idea in this analogy. It's the idea is that we experience the world as objectively changing. For example, the ship was upstream and now it's downstream. And that change is not just in my head. It's not just my ideas changing. I think the ship is moving. Now, this sort of objective experience is necessary for experience of a time order. Okay, but here's the kicker. In order to distinguish between change occurring in my ideas or representations and change occurring in an objective world, there must be a sense of causality in our spectacles, so to speak. Now, you might be lost right now, but I'll start using some concrete examples from Kant to help it sink in. So, Kant asks you to consider two types of change that you see on the screen. One in which your experience changes with the object while the object remains the same, and another in which your experience changes because the object itself is changing. So the first scenario is moving around a house and looking at it as you move around it. The second scenario is watching a ship move downstream. You can see these illustrated on the screen, but both experiences have succession. My mental or your mental experiences change one after another as you walk around the house or as you watch the ship go downstream. But the succession of changes could have occurred in the opposite direction in the case of the house, because you could have walked around the house clockwise instead of counterclockwise. That is, the change is just in your experience. The house itself is unchanged. But in the ship case, your experience could not have occurred in the opposite order. If so, you would be viewing a ship moving upstream instead of downstream. That is, in the case of the ship, there is an objective succession in addition or corresponding to my subjective succession. There's a sort of irreversibility in the ship example. Now, why is that the case? Well, it's because the human active mind organizes experiences according to a rule, which makes the order in which we experience things necessary and irreversible. This rule is causation. It's the causation spectacles. The causation spectacles are precisely the concept of succession that is necessary and irreversible. Causation is succession that's necessary and irreversible, it seems. Why do we think causes necessitate certain effects? Well, that necessity does not come from experience. It can't. Necessity can't. It comes from the spectacles, the transcendental category of causation. Now here's another way of getting at this. This is derived from the brilliant Kantian scholar Lawrence Pasternack, who's currently at Oklahoma State. Number one, first note that I cannot think something has happened unless I can contrast the present state with the preceding state. Second, now, how can I distinguish the subjective order, the house, from the objective order, the ship, since a series of distinct apprehensions does not on its own give me one? That is, the one was I cannot contrast the present state with the preceding state. Okay, step 3. Irreversibility marks the difference between the ship and the house. So how is this possible? Step 4. Irreversibility cannot be gathered from the apprehensions themselves. In the house example, for example, I cannot posit the objective order from the order of appearances. Again, because of the house example, you can go in either direction. Okay. Step 5. If irreversibility cannot be gathered from the apprehensions themselves, and if irreversibility is necessary for experience, then it's an a priori condition. All right. Number 6. That which provides the possibility of the unity of senses of the manifold, whereby there is irreversibility, irreversible succession, is the relation of cause and effect. Thus, it's an a priori condition for the possibility of the experience of objects that they stand in cause-effect relation to one another. All right, that's a mental workout, right? Okay. But that's what Kant does for one. Right? As you can see, such insights and arguments will help us think more deeply about our experiences in philosophy. Again, what follows is from the cause being in the spectacles. What follows from that? Well, the sciences are warranted in seeking cause and effect relations. They have a firm foundation. So, in contradiction to Hume, we are transcendentally justified in claiming the world is causal. Yes, we don't know reality in itself, but we can know this phenomenal world, with time and lots of science and math, because this phenomenal world is a jewel. And this jewel of a world is made by the mold of the mind. Right? All right. So now, just for some fun, I sometimes pursue the following types of possibilities. So some physicists suggest that time may flow backwards, which is impossible to really imagine because of our causation spectacles. However, mathematics, in my opinion, is grounded in the space-time spectacles, not the causation ones. So such unimaginable scenarios arise from pure math, I believe. There's a famous paper called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. I might do a video on that eventually. But one reason it might be unreasonably effective is because there are types of math that are limited only by the space-time spectacles, not the spectacles of the 12 categories. Therefore, the ultimate end of math will be to create a science that just doesn't make conceptual sense, according to the 12 categories. And I think we may already be there. Okay. Okay, so let me move on from that nonsense there, craziness. Okay. Kant also talks a lot about the unifying nature of consciousness. And here's a rough outline of it. In all representations and concepts and knowledge, there's a necessary unity presupposed. For example, I don't experience greenness and then roughness in a disconnected way. Rather, they're unified in thingness with the thought of a thing called a tree. Right? And there's this unity flowing, and that leads to the categories. There's a deep unity in consciousness itself behind the 12 categories. The unity is like a spring from which flow the understanding and its categories and the intuitions of space and time. This unifying synthetic activity all flows from the structure of deep consciousness. It's all a priori. Okay, so the main idea is the mind is a unifying force, and this leads to many insights. For example, where does the idea of a grand unified theory come from? Why do we think there's unity and diversity? Or where does the idea of God come from? After all, we don't see God like we see causes in the world or trees. Well, just as the categories unify the manifold of sensory data, so the unification continues upward. God is the grand unified and unconditioned principle. God has meaning as the ultimate unconditioned unification. Now, does this God exist? Well, we can't really say, since the idea comes from the unifying force of the mind instead of the categories that unify the chaos of the senses. Since we have no access to the noumenal world, it's possible that God exists. As does free will, by the way, but I won't go there for now. It's possible that God exists, but is unknowable to the human mind. We simply cannot apply the categories of thought, or the intuitions of space and time, beyond the sensory realm. Now, an intelligent agnostic could use such reasoning to win almost any argument in a way. No amount of logic, science, philosophy, or math could prove or disprove God, since these methods are limited to phenomenal reality. They're bound by the categories. The idea of God as a grand unity is not contradictory, but it's unknowable through the senses or concepts. All right. So that's an interesting point about this deep unifying consciousness and what it leads to. And it's very complex, right? Okay, let's see. Okay, so notice this unifying force too spurs us on to create ever wider scientific hypotheses to explain the world. It spurs us on to a grand unified theory, an ideal goal that motivates scientists and philosophers. Notice too, when you reflect back on this, all of Kant's project, what we explored so far, he's leaving this old way of thinking, which tried to determine whether our ideas correspond to reality. Right? He's revolutionary because he's showing us how our fundamental, unchosen, a priori ideas, I guess you could call them, constitute reality. Now, Kant is not saying we arbitrarily create and constitute reality, as some relativists after him have claimed. Rather, the forms, the categories, the intuitions of space and time, all these things in our mind force us to structure and constitute reality in certain ways. They force every human being to see in this way. Now, through science and math, we can discover the world makes sense. We discover causes and effects. But as Robert Solomon points out, that's not very surprising. It's no more surprising than a ceramic mold fitting a piece of jewelry, since the mold gave rise to the shape of the jewelry, right? So your mind is not passive. It's an active mold, so to speak, that constitutes this jewel of a world that we're slowly figuring out the mold or the shape of through science, logic, math, and so on. So all knowledge, then, is knowledge of our experience. It's knowledge of reality through our categories of the mind. And that's interesting to think about. Now, Kant has been very influential. His ideas have been interpreted, misinterpreted, added upon, and so on. And they've given rise to, the relativism, absolutism debate of the 20th century. They've influenced many aspects of the philosophies of Hegel and Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And this in turn has influenced Marx, the use of hermeneutics, and so on. Some, I think, misunderstand Kant. They use his theory to support a type of relativism. They think we think through the languages of our culture and time, which is partly true, but Kant's insights about space and time and the categories of the mind go much deeper. The Kantian spectacles are universal. Kant is not a relativist. Every human experiences an external world in space and time. That's universal. Each culture may identify things differently in space and time, but space and time and some other spectacles are universal. Now, whatever your opinion, the point is that Kant is very influential, and there is good reason to believe he's the greatest of the modern philosophers. So if you want to learn more about him, where do you go? Well, in my opinion, the clearest intro to Immanuel Kant's critique is still in Volume 6 of Copplestone's History of Philosophy. He spends about 175 pages, I think, explaining those ideas. Now, many introductory philosophy books try to explain Kant's critique as well. And I think one of the better ones is Solomon's Introducing Philosophy in the epistemology section. And what I like about his intro is that he clearly outlines some of the ways Kant influenced those who followed him. Now, if you're really serious and want to read the critique itself, I recommend a guidebook. And the best that I know is Sebastian Gardner's Routledge Philosophy Guidebook to Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason. Read the critique and Gardner's guide together slowly. Take many notes, draw pictures, okay? And you'll slowly come to understand this genius of Immanuel Kant. Copplestone's section on Kant takes a few hours. Reading the critique with Gardner's guide will take a few weeks or months. So have fun. Thanks.